the Transition Dialogue podcasts. My name is Alicja Pacewicz. I'm an expert in education at the Center for Citizenship Education in Poland. And this is part of a project that we have started some time ago with the participation of countries from the Eastern and Central Europe that have gone through transition from communism to, yes, we don't know exactly how to call the period we are in. Some countries say transition has ended in the 90s. It began in 1989 in Poland, but then went through the whole Eastern and Central Europe. And some people say it has ended in the 90s or in the moment when some of our countries entered the European Union. But there are others who are saying that we are still in transition. And it's very interesting and insightful to look into the period that we are going through. This is a very unique experience, the generational experience of not only one generation, the one that has brought the transition into life, but also all the generations that came later and are living the consequences of the political, social, economic transformation. This is a sort of a dream come true, not only from the political perspective of the fall of communism, but also a sort of a dream come true for a historian, for a social psychologist, for a sociologist. This big wave of changes that happened here is really something completely unique and not so easy to understand. Some people call it a self-limiting revolution. Others say it was just, one of the many social changes that the humanity went through. Whatever the perspective you take, it's incredible to look into how in our countries, in different countries, in Poland, Lithuania, Germany, Bulgaria, Russia, Ukraine, how it was done and what are the big differences between our different ways of transition, but also what are the similarities, the general patterns that we can observe. But the goal of the Transition Dialogue project is not really to find the historical truth about transition. It's more about teaching transition and talking on transition, how the knowledge and perceptions of transition are formed and how they are then spread, and what is the relation, for example, between public discourse on what has happened in our countries and how it's then taught in the schools. So why are we doing this? We are doing this to really become more aware of how transition is and can be taught and can be debated in the schools and in informal settings in our countries, while using the incredible opportunity to have sort of a cross-border angles. That's why we are inviting you to a series of podcasts, Transition Dialogues, in which we will dialogue about three important topics. Now we are inviting you to listen to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast Crime and Punishment, Transitional Justice in Post-Communist Countries.
So we are going to talk today about transitional justice in Eastern Europe. and specifically about crime and punishment. And I have always asked myself, how relevant is this problem today? And whether the question of transitional justice is only theoretical and historical question, or it could explain somehow the events and the developments in our countries right now. And I think it will be a good idea to compare the experience of two different countries, Poland, represented by Stanislav, who is, because Poland was one, at least from Bulgarian point of view, it was always regarded as a very positive example with regard to the transitional justice. While here in Bulgaria, we have always thought of ourselves, and I think it is also a truth, that Bulgaria lagged behind Central Europe with regard to transitional justice. So I think the first important question that we should try to address is the question about political background, collapse of communism in our respective countries, in Poland and in Bulgaria, and how representative is the experience of those countries with regard to other countries in Eastern European region. So Stanislav, please,
Okay.
if you can explain the Polish example, I would be very grateful.
Okay, thank you very much, Momchil, for this introduction. And I will also start with two very short, brief introductory points. The first is that difference between my and Momchil's point of view is not only the difference between two countries, but also two generations. As Momchil, you are the part of transition in Bulgaria. Me, I am the representative of the generation that was already born in the free Poland. In the Poland, I was born during the transition, and so that's also interesting. I'm personally this subject of crime and punishment is very important to me, and I'm very interested into this problem, as I'm not only historian but also. And the second introductory point is that you introduce Poland as a model, as a very successful example of transitional justice. I would argue with this. I think that to some extent we can say that, but I think that what is happening in Poland now, since what has been happening since 2015, is a sign that maybe not everything went very well. As for example, Polish reform of judiciary is justified by today's ruling party, by the fact that the decommunization of judiciary was not held, or was held insufficiently. I think that the most important thing to say is that Polish transition was peaceful transition, and it was peaceful because of its origin. The origin of Polish transition was not a revolution, was not outbreak of public social energy, but the talks, round table talks of the early 1989, when the representatives of the leaders of Communist Party, inter alia those who were also responsible for crimes of communism of 1980s, especially for martial law of 1981. They sat at the same table and talked about the political future of Poland, with their with their victims, with the leaders of the anti-communist opposition, who were sitting in who were held in prison like 2-3 years before. So this was a kind of paradox, and this successful outcome of these roundtable talks led in brief to formation of first of first government with non-communist prime minister, the representative of opposition Tadeusz Mazowiecki. But in this first let's say non-communist prime minister's government, there were still representatives of communists. So the communists, the communist leader were invited to the new political elites of the Third Republic. So it was totally different than in Romania, the case of Ceausescu, or in Czech Republic, or in than in Eastern Germany, which were the countries where the decommunization of the political elites was held, and they were removed in some ways, some legal ways, from the political life for some period of time. For example, in Czech Republic till, and how this political grounds defined this transitional justice in your country.
I remember very well that in the 90s, when the transition in Bulgaria was moving very, very slowly, we have always talked that the most positive examples for us and the examples that we should have followed were the examples of Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. We haven't thought about Germany, Eastern Germany, because at that time it was already it has already became part of unified Germany. There are similarities between Bulgarian case and Polish case, and there are also differences. First, the differences, to me, it is important that the communism in Bulgaria collapsed with the resignation of the Bulgarian dictator Todor Zhivkov on 10th of November 1989. In this event, this news was extremely sudden. No one expected it to happen because he has already been in power almost 30 years. So it was a sudden shock change. At that time, already in Bulgaria existed certain, at that time they were called informal organizations, dissident organizations. They were relatively vocal, but I couldn't say that they were extremely influential. This resignation of Todor Zhivkov, it was regarded as a sort of a palace coup, as an attempt of the Bulgarian Communist Party to regain the political initiative. But very quickly it became clear that it cannot keep the political initiative, and that the anti-communist forces that quickly unified themselves into a big political party, they became important political actor. Another variable which is extremely important was that the last crime perpetrated by the communist regime in Bulgaria in the late 80s. Otherwise, after the collapse of communism, the first steps taken by Bulgaria, they were quite similar with steps taken in Poland. Of course, a little bit later, but actually we were trying to follow the Polish example. There was a round table which was convoked between former communists and anti-communist parties. It was absolutely the same. Around this round table were sitting people who were perpetrators and who were victims. The final result, and I think this is important and successful, was that also Bulgaria was in the verge of a civil war in the early 1990s. It succeeded to escape it, and finally, the Bulgarian transition was really peaceful. And I think this is important because it also should be taken into account when we're talking about transitional justice. But unlike Poland, for example, in Bulgaria, the opening of the archives of the former state security happened too late. In Bulgaria, it happened in 2007. And at that time, it was already impossible to it was impossible to have a real decommunization, meaning limiting the political rights of certain people because they were part of the state security, or they were part of the political decision body of the former Communist Party. So the former elite remained strong, and at a certain point emerged a kind of conspiratorial theory. It's not only conspiratorial; it's also a fact that the former communists succeeded to change, to transform their political power into economical power. I understand very well that the reason for this are wider political processes, but the important point here is that the former communist elite remained influential throughout the 90s, and it remained political active during whole that period.
Okay, mm, I may say that maybe there are less differences than we expected till this point, because in Poland it was the same. The former communists formed also very influential and very well economically rooted political force called Social Democratic Party of Poland, and they came into power two times in 90s and in early 2000s, in the first years of the new century. And when it comes to this decommunization problem, I may say that in Poland, the broad decommunization happened in the first years of new Polish state, only when it comes to the security the secret police members. Okay, and it was provoked by the fact that the security police was dissolved, and in order to be a worker or a policeman of the new security police forces, you needed to be verified by the commissions that were composed in majority by the opposition, anti-communist opposition members. That about 1/3 of the secret police police members, soldiers, were dismissed in 1990. So I think that it is a high number of them, and the majority of those who were really into the political cases were dismissed, were not allowed to serve anymore to the free Poland. So I think that was very good step at the beginning. But the similar move was not, for example, done when it comes to judges in Poland, and this problem is still politically important till now, because, as I mentioned, this is still brought to the political debate by the right-wing party that is at the power now since 2015, that there was not a decommunization of justice in Poland. As a matter of fact, I think that is an important question, of course, because if you want to introduce the rule of law, you need to have the good apparatus for this, and only less than 100 of judges were dismissed disciplinary in 1990s, or they were denied the right to the pension. This was a sanction, and this was only those still living judges who were responsible for very bad, very violent death penalties of the 1950s. But those who were sentencing people during the martial law, in majority were not punished and were not disbarred, and I think it is a problem. It is a problem, and I would like to pay attention to this, because there is a strong juxtaposition between Poland and Germany, for example, when it comes to this fact. In Germany, the attitude toward the judges, but not only judges, generally public functionaries who were acting legally when it comes to the communist law, but unlawfully when it comes to the human rights and when it comes to the general European standards of justice. Like, for example, those soldiers who were shooting to the people escaping from the eastern to western Berlin. They were found guilty and sentenced for very long sentences, according to general principles of human rights. Okay, this is this German attitude, this very harsh attitude. Polish attitude was quite different, because in Polish attitude was in majority of cases that if somebody did not break the law, the communist law, for example, in 1980s, while, for example, being a judge and sentencing the opposition activists protesting against the communist regime, he was not found guilty by the New Poland's courts, and it is controversial. I think it is very much controversial, and some cases I think that might be seen as outrageous. Why some people was not sentenced in this way. So maybe you have some similar cases when it comes to your country of such kind of court criminal trials.
So yes, thank you very much. I think, or surprisingly to me, I must say, here we have also a similarity. Because in Bulgaria as well, in the early 90s, part of the personnel of the state security was fired or retired. I'm not sure about the exact percentage, but for sure it's higher than 20%. But those people, in quite a lot of significant cases, they became part of the new, let's say, business elite. So they have used their old connections and their old networks for their personal gains. And people knew that very well. And those were the years of the 90s when the living conditions in Bulgaria were getting worse and worse. And it was exactly at that time that people started to be, how to say, to some extent disillusioned with the whole enthusiasm around collapse of communism, which initially was very strong. So the effect of all of this was that in Bulgaria, there were several important trials against former communist officials. But most of those trials were unsuccessful, and only few of them were successful. And those people were convicted, but for a very short period of time. But the most spectacular failure was the trial against Todor Zhivkov. And although people at that time expected that he would be sentenced for let's say, some sort of political crimes, as for example, there was an idea that Bulgaria should have become 16th Republic of the Soviet Union. It was an idea developed during the 60s, which became well known in the 90s. But he was not trialed, he was not sentenced, and he was not investigated for those crimes. He was investigated for corruption and embezzlement. Initially, he was convicted, but finally he was acquitted, and that was the first sign of some sort of a disappointment of the Bulgarian public with regard to the transitional justice. And the other important trial was the one against perpetrators, political and executioners, if I can say, of the so-called revival process against the Bulgarian Turks. And this trial also was not successful. There were several successful cases. The most important and the most famous one was the so-called Chernobyl case. And since this podcast is addressed to young people, it might be interesting to them to remember that when Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, there was how to say nuclear rain or a rain with radiation cloud that came also to Bulgaria. And since it was in May, all children, for example, they were doing their regular outdoor activities, and no one in Bulgaria was saying and trying to prevent the public from going outside or to warn the public that there is a problem. So this case was brought to the court, and finally two people, the sanitary inspector at that time and the vice prime minister who was responsible for natural disasters, they were convicted, although they were convicted to serve only 1 or 2 years in prison. And the other case which was successful was another famous case is the killing of Bulgarian dissident writer Georgi Markov, who was killed in London in the 70s by a Bulgarian state security operative. The writer was killed with so-called Bulgarian umbrella. Actually, it was a pistol hidden in the umbrella. So this was the case that was very famous during the Cold War, and in the 90s, when people started to look for the archives in the state security, it emerged that those archives were destroyed, and they were destroyed by the chief of the intelligence in the 1990s. So finally, he was brought to trial and he was sentenced to serve in prison, and he served in prison for 18 months for destruction of the file of Georgi Markov. But actually, that's the whole story of successful cases when we are talking about successful trials against former communist officials, and when we are talking about successful cases of transitional justice. Actually, the record of Bulgaria in this respect is not very positive. And the reason, I think you're absolutely right, that the reason behind this is the lack of change in the judicial. Maybe we should move to a conclusion. So
may I only add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
That, of course, I did not talk about all the cases, but I like to be precise. I must say that while in Poland the trials against the communist leaders were also unsuccessful, they were even unfinished. For example, the trial of Jaruzelski, the Communist Party leader who introduced the martial law and ended the Solidarity Revolution in 1981, it was unfinished when he died. But there were some successful trials against the functionaries of the policemen who were shooting to the miners protesting against this martial law. It took a lot of time to convict them, but they were found guilty and were sent to prison in the early 21st century. But the problem was not only the lack of the change of judges, because there were many good, decent judges also in communism. I don't have time to talk a lot about this. I wrote a book about this. It is very interesting. But the problem also was the evidence. Because the lack of the evidence. Okay, for example, those policemen shooting to the minors, protesting minors, were convicted after the third trial, because in the two first trials, they were acquitted not because they were not guilty, but because of the lack of the evidence, because the evidence was, as you mentioned, it was crushed by the communists. It vanished. So the third trial was successful only because the new evidence was found, and this new evidence was the testimony of two Polish alpinists who were training those policemen like few months after this massacre, and those policemen told them the truth, and they after many years they decided to tell it to the court, and court found those testimonies decisive to convict them. So in some times this path of the justice were not very straight, but finally the justice was done. So not in every case the justice was not done. I would like it to be on the record here.
My question is, do you think that we can have simultaneously peaceful transition? Because I think peaceful transition in our countries is the most important accomplishment. But can we have simultaneously peaceful transition and the real transitional justice? Was the lack of transitional justice, or ineffective, maybe it's more correct to say ineffective transitional justice, the price that we have paid for the peaceful transition? What do you think about such provocation, if it is a provocation, of course?
Thank you for this question. I think that yes, we can reconcile those two values, but only while admitting that it will not be possible to convict every guilty, to find to execute the justice very radically, because it always, it when you are you have to make choices in the politics and in the especially in such a very important breakthrough as transitions, and the choice, for example, to make a deal with the communists implied the fact that they were not, for example, prosecuted just afterwards. And I think that this was the price that was calculated, and it was well calculated. But still, I think that keeping this in mind, we could do better in transitional justice. We can, when it comes to especially these criminal trials, our state, I speak about Polish state, could do better, be more effective, and if more resources were put in this problem.
Thanks a lot. I must say that I completely. So first, I must admit that I have speculated with the idea from time to time that ineffective transitional justice is really the price that we paid for the peaceful transition, and that this peaceful transition was a real accomplishment. But I must say that thinking more and more about this, I completely agree with you that it's a question of institutions, of, if you want, of administration. And it's not only, I mean, I understand that in the early 90s, for example, or in the 90s in general, there was lack of political will or due to different circumstances for investigation of those crimes. But I must admit also that it was not only lack of political will, it was also ineffectiveness of administration, of institutions. And I think this is one of the main lessons that we have learned since admission into European Union, that actually administration, institutions are extremely important. And right now, of course, more and more in Bulgaria, we're talking about rule of law, whether it exists, whether it doesn't exist. But finally, we have started to realize that this concept of rule of law, which in the 90s, it looked to us very abstract thing. We didn't know what does it mean. Right now, it became very, how to say, if I can say, visible, actual. And right now we know that this concept of rule of law is not only an abstraction, it is the way that our life is ordered. And I think this is one of the important lessons from the transitional justice and from the ineffectiveness of transitional justice in the case of Bulgaria. Thanks a lot.
This podcast was part of a Transition Dialogue project. Transition Dialogue, dealing with change in democratic ways.